Last year, we focused on the first chapter of Shmos. And this year, I think we should start with the second chapter, pick up more or less where we left off last year, at the end of the first parak and the beginning of the second parak. So I'd like tonight to highlight some of the points that I think have to be connected in the second parak of Shmos, meaning there are dots that have to be connected. Let's begin in Parak Beis with the story of the Bas Paro discovering the infant. And it says in the pasuk, Vatikach lo tevas gomer, and she takes a reed basket, she places the baby in the reed basket, and the baby is placed on the edge of the Nile. And Vatesatzev achoso merochok. So now we're talking about Miriam, the older sister of Moshe, and she is now standing from afar, and she's curious to see what's going to happen with little Moshe. And the Torah describes in Pasuk Hey, Vatered Bas Paro lirchotz al haya'or. And Chazal say that it wasn't just that she went down to bathe in the Nile, but she rather went down to convert. She was involved in the Tvila of Gerus. And there are many halachic issues here about the status of Gerus before Matan Torah. But whichever way it is, it's crystal clear that she must have perceived something miraculous. And as a result, she was uplifted to want to become part of the Jewish nation. And the Torah describes how she sees the teva, Vatishlach es hamasa vatikochea, and she stretches out her arm and she takes hold of the teva. And Rashi says that this would have been impossible based on the laws of nature. The teva was too far away from her, but somehow a miracle took place and her hand stretched out. And then in Pasuk Vav, Vatiftach, and she opens this teva, Vatir'eu es hayeled, and she saw the child. V'hinei nar bocheh. What is the significance of, first of all, Vatir'eu es hayeled? Can we find some sort of deeper meaning in this Vatir'eu es hayeled? Rashi says, Es mi rasa medrasho sharasa imot shchina. Pharaoh's daughter saw something that maybe you and I wouldn't have seen. She perceived the Shechina, the divine presence, on Moshe Rabbeinu. And imagine what was going through her mind. She's the daughter of Pharaoh. She understands that he is declaring war on the firstborn males of the Jewish people. And yet, she knew that there was a Yosef who was the great ruler of Egypt. And although history in Mitzrayim had forgotten about Yosef, and the kings made believe they didn't know about Yosef, but she knew about Yosef. She understood that Yosef must have had a divine presence, and now that divine presence was passed down to, in this case, the baby, but through the generations of the Jewish people. She realized that there's greatness here. Imagine Bas Paro could perceive greatness. She could perceive the Shekhinah, the divine presence. I mean, that's an unbelievable achievement. for a girl who was brought up in the palace of Paro as the daughter of Paro, and yet she sees in a Jewish baby greatness. She perceives something that, again, you and I wouldn't have seen. And perhaps if we go one step further, Vatereu es hayeled, she saw the potential in this child. She understood that her father had certain negative motives. He wanted to condemn a child like this to death. She understood that her father would call this child, a Jewish boy, a subhuman. And imagine the courage of this young woman to reject her father and to defy his decree. V'hinei nar boche. What is the significance of v'hinei nar boche? On the one hand, the Gemara in Sota has a whole discussion about the tone of voice that came from Moshe, the little baby. And it was apparently a very atypical kind of pitch. It was very deep, a deep pitch, which would not be typical of a young child. It was a nar, almost the pitch of a nar. And the Gemara tells us Rabbi Nehemiah, one of the Tanoim, rejected this because later on Moshe would serve as a Levi, and there's such a thing as a psul mum in a Levi, and a thick voice, a deep voice, is one of the mumin, the blemishes. So therefore, Rabbi Nehemiah says it's impossible. And the Gemara goes on to defend Rabbi Nehemiah that although the baby had a louder voice than a simple child, it was more robust, and it was more typical of an adolescent voice, but nevertheless, it wasn't the deep voice that would be possible as a mum. But I would like to suggest tonight a deeper meaning to this crying of the baby. Forget about the Gemara and Sota for a minute, because Al Pi Pshat, we really have to study exactly what was different about the voice of this baby. Was it a deeper voice, and that would make it a mum? Was it perhaps a more robust voice, typical of an older child? But what is the significance beyond Pshat on a deeper level? And I searched through Midrashim, and I was not satisfied. I thought that we could add something here that would be profound. The power of Moshe Rabbeinu, over and over again, throughout his career as a leader of Klal Yisrael, is in his voice, is in his tefillos. Hashem, after the Egel, says Heref Mimin, which was a hint to Moshe Rabbeinu that he should start praying. And he prays on behalf of Klal Yisrael, and he saves Klal Yisrael because God had decided to destroy the people of Israel for the worst of violations of Avodah Zarah at the time of the Egel. And we find throughout the history of Moshe Rabbeinu, he's constantly there to cry out on behalf of the people of Israel. So perhaps we could suggest that already as an infinite, Hine Anar Boche, this is already foretelling the entire career of Moshe Rabbeinu as a crier. What does it mean to cry? A baby cries and it's spontaneous. It's almost instinctual. But when a mature person cries, that's a whole different story. Most people, when they mature, they find it difficult to cry. Crying is so much more common amongst small young infants. And it's really a loss when mature man becomes so intellectual, so rigid, so mechanical about life, that he doesn't have the ability to cry out, to link up with that beautiful sound of a baby crying. However, Moshe Rabbeinu lets out a wail, a cry, and perhaps it pierced the air of the entire riverbank around the Nile River. And Moshe Rabbeinu's cry symbolically, metaphorically represents the supplication of a leader crying out on behalf of his people, like a child cries to a father or to a mother. And a child thrusts his burden on a parent and believes that the parent is there to protect him. Can we as adults cry out to Hashem like a child to a father and express with that tear, with that wail, our dependence upon God, our reliance on that God will defend us like a father, he will protect us. And what happened there at the bank of the Nile is that the teacher of Israel, the leader of Israel, would break out in a cry and a wail on behalf of his people. And this is going to happen over and over again until Moshe Rabbeinu hands over the baton to Yoshua, who crosses into the land. And we go on in the pasuk, Vatomer achotzo el bas paro. And now Miriam is turning to Bas Paro with the most brilliant and perhaps most significant suggestion and recommendation in all of history. And that is Ha'elech v'karasi loch isha meinekes mina ivrios v'seinekes hayel. Why is this pasuk, this statement and impact that Miriam has on Bas Paro so significant? And the answer is, had Moshe Rabbeinu been brought up in the house of Paro, there was no chance that he could be a leader of Klal Yisrael. He would have no connection to his brethren. He would have been brought up in the isolated and beautiful palace, the insulated and isolated palace of Paro, with no connection to his brethren. He would hardly have known that he was a Jew, let alone would he have any comprehension of the unique nature of the Jewish people as a covenantal community. But Miriam, as we would say colloquially, steps up to the plate. And at that critical moment, that's the greatest leaders that we have in Klal Yisrael, like Yehuda, when he influenced his father Yaakov to send him down to the viceroy of Egypt. Here too, she steps up to that critical moment. Now I have to give a response to Bas Paro and recommend to Bas Paro that we get one of the Jewish Hebrew women to nurse the baby. And that would be the mother of Moshe Rabbeinu, Yocheved, who would raise this child until the point that after he realizes the suffering of his brethren, he very much identifies them, he goes out to personally witness the suffering of his people. So it's all, we really owe all our gratitude to Miriam. Because without Miriam, we wouldn't have had Moshe, we wouldn't have the leader of Israel, we wouldn't have had the Redeemer of Israel, we wouldn't have Geula. All her love, the love of a mother, in this case Yocheved, for Moshe, would bring up a young man with love for his brothers. And therefore he could rise up to be the leader of Klal Yisrael. Otherwise he would have totally been lost in oblivion. He would have been ignorant of his people. He would have been melted into the Egyptian society. And we needed, this was the destiny of the covenantal community, to have a mother raise her own son in the palace of Paro. And in the very next pasuk, Vayigdal Hayeled. What does it mean, Vayigdal Hayeled? Once again, on a surface level, the Torah is just recording the fact that the child grew up and he matured. But perhaps we could suggest on a deeper level that Vayigdal means he became a gadol. He became great. And what makes him great? And the pasuk tells us what makes him great. In the next pasuk it says, Vayigdal Moshe vayetzel el echa vayar b'sivloso. What is the measure of greatness? When a person breaks out of his own self-centered little circle in order to see that there are greater concerns than his own parochial concerns and self-centered concerns. When he realizes that he has brothers who are suffering, that's a sign of greatness. Moshe Rabbeinu could have easily rested on his laurels, taking it easy in the insulated palace of Paro. But no, Vayigdal Hayeled, Vayigdal Moshe. He became great. And he identified with his people. Vayetze el Echav Vayar B'Sivlosam. Once again, the purpose of my shir tonight is to prove that we can get away with reading the psukim on the simplest level, but we would not be doing justice unless we dipped a little bit below the surface. Moshe went out to his brothers, if we translate this literally, and looked upon their burdens. No. This pasuk is teaching us what sets the stage for Moshe in the next section to be appointed by HaKadosh Baruch Hu as the Redeemer of Israel. Why? Why is Moshe Rabbeinu chosen for this great task, to be the Goel Yisrael? And the answer is right here, Vayar B'Sivlosam. Imagine, here's a young man who was brought up in the house of Paro, in the wealth and the glamour of the palace of Paro, and he leaves the palace. And perhaps this is the first time he goes out of the palace. We don't know. We can only guess. But he goes out of the palace for what purpose? Vayetzel Echav, to see his brethren. But I would go beyond that. What do you mean to see his brethren? Vayar B'Sivlosam, he wants to identify with their suffering. He didn't have to identify with their suffering. He was well protected in the four cubits of Paro's palace. He was reared in the home of Paro, but he wanted to break out of the palace of Paro. He had feelings of Echav. Echav means brotherhood. Imagine Moshe Rabbeinu being brought up in the house of Paro, but feeling an identification and a brotherhood with the Jewish slaves. That's an amazing accomplishment. And Vayar B'Sivlosam means a lot more than just he saw their suffering. He realized that this was a downtrodden people. He identified with them. I would like to read to you the language of the Rambam. In the second chapter of Hilchas Tshuva. And the Rambam there discusses individuals who basically forfeit their ability to do tshuva. Obviously, if the Rambam's talking about that, then it's a very extreme kind of case. The Rambam speaks about a person who cuts himself off from the tzibur of Klal Yisrael, a person who doesn't identify with the people of Israel. He feels no solidarity with his Jewish brothers. He does not do mitzvahs together with them. He does not identify with the travails of the congregation of Israel. He separates himself. Even though, says the Rambam, he has committed no sin. And the Rambam says he forfeits his place in the world to come. He has withdrawn from the Jewish community. He's a poresh minat tzibur. And if he feels no sense of solidarity with his Jewish brothers, he doesn't identify with their fate and their destiny, he has no share in the world to come. That's what it says in the Rambam. I didn't write the text, but it fits beautifully when we want to see why Moshe Rabbeinu became and was appointed by God, singled out to be the Redeemer of Israel, the leader of his people. Because if you're not going to identify with the people, if you don't feel their suffering, their pain, their travails, if you don't identify with their humiliation and subjugation, then you have no share in the world to come. And it's not enough just to know as an intellectual knowledge what these people, the Israelites are going through. That's not sufficient. You're talking about identifying with the nation's pain and suffering on an emotional level, on an existential level. This is the introduction to Moshe Rabbeinu as the Redeemer of Israel. And then the Torah tells us a story, which again, we can read on one superficial level, but my goal is to read between the lines on a deeper level. We're up to Pasuk Yud Beis, or let's see the end of Pasuk Yud Aleph. Vayar ish mitri makeh ish ivri me'achav. And he saw an Egyptian man striking a Hebrew man of his brothers. Vayar ki ein ish vayaches ha-mitzri. He turned away this way and that way, and he saw that there was no man, and he struck the Egyptian. Let's notice a few interesting things about this pasuk. The Mitzri is described as an ish. The Ivri is described as an ish. And Vayar ki ein ish. Moshe sees there's no ish. And then Vayach es ha-Mitzri. It should have said Vayach es ha-ish. What's the transition between the Reisha and the Sefer, between the ish and the Mitzri? I want to tell you something that's very painful. There were many Jews in Egypt who were assimilated. They looked at the glamour and the beauty of Egyptian culture, and they identified with the Egyptians. Many of them didn't leave Mitzrayim. They melted in with the Egyptians. In contemporary language, and I hope this is politically correct, I would classify these Jews as liberals. These are the liberals. And they believed that amongst the Egyptians, likewise, there would be liberals. And therefore, liberals attract liberals and they can assimilate together. The Egyptian culture, from the perspective of an assimilated Jew, means that Egypt represents human beings that have mercy and compassion. And therefore, the Torah describes this Mitzri as an ish. Vayar ish Mitzri. What does it mean, ish Mitzri? The word ish indicates a man of culture, a man of society, of advanced knowledge. And who is the Jew, the Ivri, that's being hit? Ish Ivri. He too is an ish. He's a liberal who believes in the Egyptian liberals. He believes that the Egyptians really have within them the possibility of becoming an ish. And the Ivri as an ish identifies with the ish Mitzri. They both are described in the pasuk as ish. In fact, the pasuk says, ish Ivri me'echav. What does the word me'echav mean? It's a dangling modifier. You can interpret it in one of two ways. Either me'echav means from his brothers, referring to Moshe Rabbeinu, or perhaps ish me'echav refers back to the ish Mitzri. That one ish looks at the other ish as echav, as my brother. So the liberals in any exile represent those Jews who think that the Goyim are also liberal. They also have brothers. And they also have respect for us. And will treat us with dignity. But here comes the Shakaru. Vayar, what does Moshe Rabbeinu perceive? Ish Mitzri Makeh. Ish Ivri Me'echav. that Ish Ivri, who thinks that the Egyptian, who's also an Ish, who is a dignified human being with compassion and feeling, with a liberal attitude, progressive, now hits him in a cruel way and bursts the bubble. When the Egyptian taskmaster smites the Jew, now he shatters the concept of Mei Echav. You think that you can identify these Egyptians with you, they're brethren of yours? You're living in a false world. The Egyptian will hit you no matter what. You could be the most liberal, progressive, and identify with the culture around you. It doesn't matter. And I think of the Germans during the Holocaust. I mean, they couldn't care less whether you were cultured, whether you were a scientist, whether you were a Nobel Prize, whether you were a Jew. And we're going to humiliate you and destroy you. And therefore, Ayifen ko v'cho, vayar ki ein ish. Oh no, says Moshe Rabbeinu. The Mitzri is not an ish. He may look in the guise of an ish. He looks on the outside to be cultured, to be liberal and progressive, to identify with the downtrodden. No. That's just a facade. Ein ish. He's not an ish. And therefore, Vayaches HaMitzri, and the Torah deliberately omits the word ish, because now we know who the Mitzri is. The Mitzri shows no promise, no pretense of humanity, of compassion. He's not an ish at all. He's just a Mitzri. He's just a hater, an adversary of the Jews, to humiliate the Jews. And I believe that this encounter of Moshe Rabbeinu with the Mitzri is a great discovery for Moshe Rabbeinu. It's an eye-opener for him. And that's why the Torah records it as the very first experience of Moshe Rabbeinu when he leaves the insulated palace of Pharaoh. What he sees is the brutal attack of an Egyptian taskmaster against a defenseless Jew. And he realizes the immorality of Egypt. But I would like to suggest a contrast here between Avram Avinu and Moshe Rabbeinu. In the case of Avram Avinu, when he came in contact, when he encountered the immorality of the nations, the Kazdim around him, the paganistic cultures and the human sacrifices, and Nimrod, who would take Avram and throw him, cast him into a furnace, Avram Avinu emerges from the furnace as a totally transformed individual. He rebels against the society. He becomes aware of its immorality, of the rotten nature of the world of idolatry around him, and he sheds that all. And in a sense, you could say that he becomes a friend of the lonely God, the God who is alienated from a world of idolatry and immorality. But by contrast, we're sort of shocked by Moshe Rabbeinu's response. Moshe Rabbeinu, like Avram Avinu, discovers the immorality of the society he lives in. In that sense, he reveals the moral law, but there doesn't seem to be a transformation of his personality. We don't see in Moshe Rabbeinu the same sort of metamorphosis that we saw in Avram Avinu, who is called the Avram HaIvri. Ivri means me'ever anor. He completely rejects the society of the world, the immorality of man for the sake of a moral law. And I'll prove it to you. If you fast forward to Pasuk Yutes, you will see that when Moshe Rabbeinu comes to the daughters of Yisro, and they go back, and when Yisro asks them, who protected you? Their answer is, Ish Mitzri hitzilanu miyad haroim. And Chazal say that Moshe Rabbeinu was taken to task because he did not. How are you, Chaim? You there? How you doing? Good to see you. Okay, Chaim. So there are a number of Chaims here, so you don't know which Chaim I'm referring to. There's one of three. But in any event, what is Moshe Rabbeinu's response when Yosef is accused of whatever he was accused of there in Eishes Potiphar? He says, Ganov Gunavti Eretz HaIvrim. He identifies himself as an Ivri. But Moshe Rabbeinu is identified by Benos Yisrael as Ish Mitzri. And Moshe says nothing. And Chazal say in the Medrash, as a result, Moshe Rabbeinu would not be buried as Yosef was in the land of Israel. At what point does Moshe Rabbeinu make this transition and a metamorphosis in which he identifies himself with the people of Israel totally? He's no longer a Mitzri. This is going to happen later on in our Sedra at the Sneh. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu challenges Moshe at the Sneh, and there's an ongoing dialogue and debate for a week, Moshe Rabbeinu realizes that his mission, again, from this magic of the scene of the burning bush, he realizes that his mission is to redeem his people. And now he undergoes a perfect, total transformation of personality. Torah continues, but again, we have to read below the storyline. Vayetze b'yom hasheni. On the very next day, Moshe Rabbeinu goes out. There's a quarrel, a contention between two Jews. And Moshe Rabbeinu cries out, why are you so evil that you're hitting your friend? And the response was, Chazal say this is Dasan Vaviron, Mi samcha le'ish sar v'shofet oleinu. Such words of chutzpah. I mean, after all, Moshe Rabbeinu did what no other Jew would do. And to protect his fellow Jew, he killed a Mitzri and saved the life of a Jew. Halargeni ata omer kasher raktas ha-Mitzri. And Moshe Rabbeinu realizes that this group of people, these evil Jews, had snitched on him. They were Mosrim. And Rashi points it out here on the next pasuk. It says, "Vayomer Moshe declares Achein Noda Hadover." What does that mean? Noda Hadover. Kipshuto means that the word is out that I killed the Mitzri. But Midrash Rashi says on a deeper level. Again, let's read the words below the surface line. Noda li Hadover shayisi tomelav ma chatu Yisrael mikol shivim ha'umos lius nirdim yavodas parach. Why, God? Where is the justice? There are 70 nations on the face of the earth. Is the Jewish nation more guilty and more criminal than the 70 other nations? Why is this nation chosen, singled out to suffer the slavery, the humiliation, the physical destruction that they went through? What are they guilty of? Achein noda dova. Says Rashi in the name of the Medrash, Aval roa ani shehem re'uyim lekach. My friends, this is the most harsh statement that you can imagine that comes from the mouth of Moshe Rabbeinu. Re'uyim lekach. They deserve the slavery. This is Moshe Rabbeinu, the great protector of Israel, the one who, as we said before, cries to supplicate in front of God and defend the people. He's the glorious Rabbi Yitzchak Berditcheva of all times, the Sanegar of all times, and yet, if the Jewish people could stoop to such a low level as Dasan Vavira, in which one Jew beats up another, that's bad enough. In which one Jew talks chutzpahdik to Moshe, that's also bad. But the worst is that they could snitch on Moshe Rabbeinu when Moshe Rabbeinu protected one of the brethren, something that no other Jew could have done. It's interesting that the pasuk says, "Halargeni ata omer kasher haragta es ha-mitzri." You killed the mitzvah. Rashi tells us, how did Moshe Rabbeinu kill the mitzvah? B'shem ha-meforash he called. Where's the Rashi? Just 1 second. Yeah, mikan anu lemedim shahargo b'shem ha-meforash. Rashi doesn't exactly clarify how we know that Moshe Rabbeinu killed the mitzvah with Shem HaMeforash. I mean, the pasuk says, Vayaches HaMitzri. How do we know it was with the Shem HaMeforash? And somehow, Rashi derived it from Halargeni Ata Omer. The words Ata Omer mean that the Harry came from an Amira, in which Moshe Rabbeinu pronounced the Shem HaMeforash. But once again, Rabbosai, I would like to look at this on a deeper level, below the surface, below the official line, of the book of books. The Rambam writes in Hilchas Malachim, Perek Yud, Halacha Vav, Goy shehika Yisrael, afilu chaval bo. In other words, he didn't kill a Jew, he smites a Jew. The Rambam writes he's chayav misa. But afal pishu chayav misa eno nerak. What does this mean? If you look into the Kesef Mishnah, the Radbaz, especially the Radbaz, what you see here is that the Rambam derived from a Gemara in Sanhedrin, which in turn derived from our Parsha, that the reason why Moshe Rabbeinu put the Mitzri to death is because the halach is a benoach shehika Yisrael chayav misa. But the Rambam says Eino Nera. What does that mean, Eino Nera? We have 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach, and a non-Jew will be judged for any violation of any of the 7, and he's condemned to death. But hitting a Jew is not one of the 7 mitzvahs b'nei Noach. So the commentaries on the Rambam say that this din of Misa to the Mitzri is a din bidei shamayim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will take his life. And now we could plug in the Rashi that hadn't Moshe Rabbeinu killed the Mitzri, Shem HaMeforash. He was not actively involved in putting the Mitzri to death. That he couldn't do because of Ben Noach, Shehika Yisrael, although he's Chayav Misa, Eino Nerag. In a Bezdin, in a Jewish court, we cannot put him to death. But God put him to death. And it was a Misa B'dei Shamayim, and that's what Shem HaMeforash is all about. It's not a direct physical act of killing someone, which Bezdin could do, but not in this case. But rather, it was just speaking Ata Omer, and the emphasis is that although Moshe Rabbeinu could not legally affect the death penalty on the Mitzri, but nevertheless, by enunciating the divine name, the Mitzri was killed b'dei Shamayim. Vayira Moshe mi'od in Pasuk Yudal. Vayira Moshe vayomer achein noda adova. This incident of the 2 feuding Jews, one Jew hitting the other, had such an impact on the sensitive soul of Moshe Rabbeinu that Moshe Rabbeinu became depressed. Achein noda adova. Noda adova, says Rashi, now I know, Ru'uyim lekach, they deserve the slavery and the oppression, and they're not worthy of redemption and of freedom. And what does it mean when the pasuk says, Vayomer, Vayira Moshe, Vayira Moshe? What's the Vayira Moshe? Why did the Torah add Vayira Moshe? if we're interpreting the way Rashi interprets based on Chazal, that Vayira Moshe Vayomer Achei Nod Hadavar, now I understand. Now I comprehend why the divine plan and faith for the Jewish people was that they would be subjugated to slavery. Now I understand it. So what's Vayira Ma'od? Well, Vayira Ma'od makes sense on one level, because Paro is no doubt going to avenge the death of that mystery and have Moshe Rabbeinu killed, as it says in the next pasuk, Vayivakesh Laroges Moshe. That I could understand Vayira Moshe. But what's Vayira Moshe when he finds out and realizes and comprehends why the Jewish people are suffering in slavery? And I would like to suggest something that's very hard to swallow, that Moshe was afraid that there was no hope for the Jewish people, that slavery had impacted on their personalities. They had become so low. They had stooped to such a low level. They sunk so deeply, as the Zohar says, to Memtesh Shari Tuma. They were living in a life of degradation, of inhumanity. And this had transformed their personalities. And they would never, ever be deserving of freedom. And that the state of slavery would exist ad infinitum. And when Moshe realized this, he had a tremendous problem. We could say he wrestled with a certain problem. The Jews deserved this suffering. God is just. But what's the future of the Jewish people? And where do I fit in? It seems that this experience of Moshe Rabbeinu, seeing one Jew hit the other Jew, etc., had such a fierce, profound impact on Moshe. It almost put Moshe into a spell. And in the very next pasuk, Vayivrach Moshe mipnei Paro, Vayeshev be'eretz Midyan, Vayeshev al habe'er. Moshe Rabbeinu leaves his people. He goes very far away to Midyan, and Vayeshev, Nachamal, a second time Vayeshev, twice in the same breath, the Torah says Vayeshev. And Chazal say that Yaakov Avinu says Vayagar. It doesn't say Vayeshev. Yaakov Avinu ended in the exile on a temporary basis, but not Vayeshev. Why does the Torah twice repeat the word Vayeshev with regard to Moshe in Midyan? And I believe, as shocking as it is, Moshe gave up. He despaired on the Jewish people. He ran away to Midyan, and he was planning to settle in Midyan for the long haul, not as a temporary resident, but as a permanent citizen. Moshe flees from Paro in a state of despair. He's frightened. Vayiram Moshe. He's disenchanted. He lost his vision of the freedom of the Jewish people. Vayivrach Moshe mipnei Paro. Now, in the timeline, how long was it between Moshe arriving in Midyan and the birth of Gershom, his first son? You take a look here in Pasuk Chav Beis. Vateled ben vayikra eshmo Gershom, ki amar gera yisi beretz nachriya. You know, you read it, it's just a few psukim later. Here in Pasuk Tesvav, number 15, Vayivrach Moshe, Vayeshev beretz Midyan. And here in Pasuk Chav Beis, 7 verses later, Gershon is born to Tzipora, Ashes Moshe. How many years went by between Vayivrach Moshe and Leidas Gershom? Chazal tell us. Are you ready for this? If you don't know it, 60 years. Did you hear me? On Zoom, I never know if you hear me. 6 decades passed. Doesn't the mind, the curious, rational mind of someone who learns Torah, and we're talking about the formation of Moshe Rabbeinu as a leader, aren't we curious to ask what went on for 60 years? And I believe that sometimes the Torah teaches us, and we are meant to learn from the silence of the Torah. The Torah was deliberately silent, omitting any mention of what transpired in the life of Moshe Rabbeinu for 6 decades. And you know what that silence is called in the Torah and in Chazal? Hester Pon. Hashem has alienated himself from Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu is in a state of Hester Pon, total silence. Nothing's happening in his life. He is disenchanted with his people. He doesn't believe that there's a ray of hope in the distance, no ray of sun shining in the horizon for the Jewish people ever to experience freedom. Slavery and Inui has done its job, has transformed the people of Israel to the lowest of the low. And there's no chance that it's going to get any better. And so 60 years go by. And that's Hester Pon. I would like to read to you a pasuk in Chumash about Hester Pon, just to get an idea in the Tochacha. This is in Parshas Vayelech, Dvarim Perek Lamed Aleph, pasuk Yud Zayin. Bechara api do bayom hahu. My fury will rage against them on that day. V'azavtim, and I will abandon them. V'starti panai mehem, I will hide my face from them. V'hayolechol, and they will be consumed. Umetza'u ros rabos v'tzoros, and many evils and troubles will befall them. V'omar bayomahu halo al ki ein Elohai b'kirbi metza'uni aros ha'ela, and the Jews will declare, it is because our God is no longer amongst us that these evils have befallen us. This pasuk describes the 60-year period of Hester Pon. The Jewish people are Ein Elokai B'Kirbi. The Almighty has risen up, so to speak, to the 7th Zvul up in the heavens. And they are consumed with evils and troubles befalling them, declaring God is no longer amongst them. This is Hester Pon. This is the time gap of the 60-year period in Moshe's life, which represents the tragic historical experience of the Jew. Not only the Jew at that time in Mitzrayim, but the Jew throughout the bitter Golus. Esther Punin. And then something happens. It's very hard for me to understand what exactly changed. We read in Pasuk of Beis, Vateled ben, Vayikra Shmo Gershom, Ki Omar Ger Hayisi B'Eretz Nochriya. I was a stranger in a foreign land. All of a sudden, Moshe Rabbeinu is remembering the fact that he's a stranger. Before the pasuk, a few psukim earlier, it said Vayeshet. He lived as a permanent resident in Midian. He was not just a sojourner, but yet Ger Hayisi Beretz Nochriya. It's almost as if Moshe Rabbeinu is breaking out of a trance. He is changing his entire worldview. He's no longer giving up on the people of Israel and his brethren. He identifies with them. He's a Ger B'Eretz Nochriya. And what comes after Chav Beis? The next pasuk, Vayhi Bayom HaRav Mahem. What do you expect for those who are Torah readers, if you are a Baal Koreh? Whenever you see Vayhi Bayom Mahem, what would separate that pasuk, Vayhi Bayom Mahem, from the previous pasuk? If you open up a Chumash, you'll find what's called a Samach. And here, open up the Chumash, and you'll see a Pei. Pei means a Parsha Psucha. Pei means we're about to open up Psucha into a new reality that's about to emerge. At this moment of time, with the birth of Gershon, a new page in Jewish history is being opened up. And the Hester Punim is now going to reach an apex, and then it's going to be removed. It's going to be disappeared. And the nation of Israel is about to emerge. In Hester Punim, forget about the nation of Israel. There is no nation of Israel. In Hester Punim, we are human beings, organisms, like any other living organism. Like a beast in a field or in a forest. There's no deeper meaning to the life of the Jew and its significance. During Hester Punim, man forfeits his singular nature. He's no longer unique. He doesn't deserve divine protection, and therefore God is behester. And I want to tell you something more. Vayhi bayomim HaRav Mahem. The passage of time. How does free man experience time? Time is precious. In halacha and Jewish law, we hallow and sanctify time. Kedushas Hazman is a fundamental principle. It's 1/6 of the Mishnayos. It's all about Kedushas Hazman. And it even goes beyond Moed. It really enters into Zroim and Shmos and so forth. But you know what? In a period of Hester Punim, when Jewish suffering is a routine, and day passes from one day to the other, one moment to the other, time just flows by. Man has no control over time. And this reminds us so much of the Holocaust. Because if you speak to people now, the rare breed who survived the Holocaust, they'll tell you that in the camps they had no track of time. Time was just buzzing by. It either went too slow or it went too fast. This is the mentality, the experience of a slave. That's why an Eved is potter from mitzvah seishas v'ayin groma. When a slave experiences fear and routine slavery and danger, he has no concept of time. It's just a collection of minutes and hours and days. When the Germans ridiculed the Jews, time accumulated without any significance whatsoever. The Jews endured the humiliation and the persecution, and so too in Egyptian slavery. There's such a direct connection between the Jewish suffering in Mitzrayim and the Jews in the concentration camps and the Holocaust. It's Vayehi Bayomim HaRabim Ahem. Now it came to pass in those many days. Again, the Torah is not speaking out about this, but in the silence of the Torah, we learn what was the experience like. They lived in a world, an experience of complete despair, forgetfulness. I would like to suggest, and I think it's a little bit of an insight into comprehending the process of redemption. 3 stages. Stage number 1 is the divine promise. And God promises that he will redeem his people. God doesn't say exactly when he's going to redeem his people. It may be a long time, but there's a vision of the future, of the end of slavery and exile. But then we go into another period, a very long period of time, which seems almost antithetical to God's divine promise. We live in Vayehi Bayomim HaRabim Ahem. We live under persecution and humiliation, subjugated in the lowest level of slavery. This is the time in between. We're in stage number 2. This is the Hester Panim, which is so antithetical to the divine promise of redemption. And then comes stage number 3. Out of nowhere, at a total surprise, God has decided to redeem the people and implement his divine promise of redemption. And we're taken by surprise. All we have is Vayomas Melech Mitzrayim Vayonchu Bnei Yisrael Ben Avoda Vayizaku Vatal Shavasam Elokim Ben Avoda Vayishma Elokim Es Na'azakum Vayizkar Elokim Es Brisa. God, all of a sudden, so to speak, wakes up and remembers the covenant after such a long period of antithetical Hester Panim and humiliation and slavery. It's a paradox. It's almost absurd. There's no logic here. A divine promise, and then such a long, drawn-out, endless period of suffering, which is antithetical to the divine promise, and then, out of nowhere, Vayizkar Elokim Es Briso Vayar Elokim Es Bnei Yisrael Vayed Elokim. And such begins the world of triumph, of freedom, of redemption. The whole thing is just one paradox. At one point in history, the message and the promise seems to be absolutely absurd. And yet, the realization of that promise, the fulfillment, out of nowhere surprises us and begins to be realized. And where are the Jews fitting into this? Vayomas Melech Mitzrayim. You and I know that during the Holocaust, in the early stages, the Jews believed that there was one fanatical anti-Semite named Hitler, Yamach Shemo, and things will get better. Hitler will be deposed, Hitler will die, and he'll be replaced by a more progressive, compassionate leader. What a tragic mistake. The Jews were living in a false world, a balloon of a hot air, a fantasy. And that's what the Torah is telling us here. Vayomas Melech Mitzrayim. The people, the Jews thought, he's gone. Paro is dead and buried. He'll be replaced by a more progressive, compassionate leader. And just the opposite happened. What a tragic mistake. The Jews in Egypt thought that the change of government would result in their favor with a new and progressive ruler. But instead, the replacement Paro was much worse than the previous Paro. And the death of one Paro meant that the Jews now would have to build, the Chazal tell us, an enormous new tomb for the corpse of Paro. And these were the humiliation of the Jews had to perform this. The lives of the Jews became even more unbearable when the next Paro replaced this one. And therefore, Vayomas Melech Mitzrayim, Vaye'anchu Bnei Yisrael min avoda. The king of Egypt died, and as a result, the children of Israel sighed from the labor. The children didn't cry until this point. But now, they thought that things would get better. And at this point, when they realized that things deteriorated and became so unbearable, they could no longer trust in history, in a replacement of one leader with another government. Now they realized they could only trust Ein lanu ela avinu shebashamayim, and vayonchu bnei Yisrael v'atal shav'osam el Elokim. Their cry ascended to God. I would like to read from an essay that I published many, many years ago called Redemption, Prayer, and Talmud Torah. In the introduction to that essay, I speak about the fact that there are two types of prayer. There's one category of prayer which is intended and structured and formulated with words and paragraphs, very sophisticated prayer. And that's not the prayer that we're talking about here. Vayizaku, and they cried out. They just groaned, they cried. It was almost intuitive. It's like an animal that cries out of pain. It was anything but an articulated, well-formulated prayer, but yet, Vatal Shavosam Elokim. Suffering is not pain. Colloquial, the two words are used as synonymous, but they signify two fundamentally different experiences. Pain is a natural sensation, a physiological reaction of an organism to any kind of tissue pathology. As Aristotle already knew, pain is a built-in mechanical signal that warns man that his physical existence is in jeopardy. Thus, pain is an integral part of the body's security system. It's an instinctual reaction. It's immediate, non-reflective. And therefore, it's not restricted to humans. The beast is also acquainted with pain. But that's not what suffering is. Suffering or distress, in contradistinction to pain, is not a sensation, but rather a spiritual reality, an experience that's known only to human beings. The animal never suffers. The animal is in pain, but not suffering. This spiritual reality is encountered by man whenever he stands to lose his sense of existential worth or security. or dignity. When a merciless reality clashes with the human existential awareness, man suffers and finds himself in distress. The animal is exposed to pain. The slave is exposed to pain. When the slave meets with pain, he reacts like an animal. He utters a sharp, shrilling sound, like the howl of a beast. So too is the shriek of a slave. But it lasts but a moment in the darkness and the hush of the night, and in a split second, all is silent again. There is no aftermath to pain, neither in the pain sensation of an animal or that of a slave. There follows no complaint, no request, no protest, no question why and what. The slave does not know suffering. He does not have an existential awareness that generates suffering. He knows pain, but not suffering. Moshe Rabbeinu, and this is the critical junction, is coming to defend the helpless Jew, to restore the sensitivity to the dull slaves, to make them realize that their pain is much more profound. It's anguish, it's humiliation. It's a response to cruelty and to evil. And this realization on the part of the Jewish people brought not only a sharp pain, but suffering as well. And with suffering came loud protest, the cry, the za'aka. And now the dead silence of non-existence was gone. The voice of human existence was now heard. And in this second stage, with the awakening of that awareness, prayer makes its entry. And we shift from the cry, the instinctual cry of pain of an animal responsive of the slave, to that of a human being in prayer. In truth, Za'aka is a middle stage. It's an intermediary stage. It's a human outcry. It's the beginning, the commencement of suffering. It's not yet tefillah. Tefillah is well formulated. And now there's just crying out of an existential sensitivity and awareness of suffering. Tza'aka is primordial tefillah, primordial prayer. The voice is restored, but the words are lacking. And it's only in stage 3 that man rises from the voice to the words in formulating prayer. However, here, and we have to conclude, it's getting late. Vayishma Elokimis na'akasa. God sees, hears, and remembers everything. Na'akasa. The great chesed of God is that God hears the beginning of prayer and he accepts it on high as if it were sophisticated prayer. And God is ready to uphold the covenant and bring about the redemption of Klal Yisrael. So where did we get up to? So we'll know for next year. We pretty much finished Perek Beis. And next year, Bli Neder, we have to study Perek Gimel. An amazing chapter in Sefer Shmos. There's so much there. But my main goal is to make us aware of the fact that Torah could be studied on so many different levels. You could read the storyline and superficial interpretation and translation, but you have to read between the lines. And sometimes even the silence is loud and meaningful. Yiratzah maybe as will. That we see the end of our goals, that we are now, Emir Hashem, on the roll towards redemption. We have to take advantage of linking with our leaders, of prayer on the highest level, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Emir Hashem, should hear and hearken to our prayers and bring the Melech HaMashiach, the ultimate Geula, B'mheirav Yameinu Amen. I want to thank you and wish you all a Shabbat Shalom, a great Shabbos Parshas.
Shukran, HaRav. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great share.
Thank you so much.